Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you all, even if it's virtual. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're here today to talk about collaboration. Now, collaboration is the kind of thing that seems pretty simple and straightforward, but in practice, of course, can be quite tricky and quite difficult. We do know, though, that when we bring people together to solve big challenges, that's when great ideas can really grow. And that's actually the primary thinking behind why we founded the Heartland Summit a couple years ago, which is a conference on economic development that I started with my husband Tom and my brother-in-law Stuart, who you'll hear from in a couple minutes. So despite the fact that we know how effective collaboration is, so many of the biggest problems we face today are really frustrated by a lack of collaboration and a lack of sustainable collaboration models. So today I am delighted to be joined by Steve Case to talk about what makes collaboration really work and how it can be made sustainable. For those of you who don't know, Steve is an entrepreneur. He is a passionate investor and he is a philanthropist. Steve is also a pioneer of the internet, of course, because he's a co-founder of AOL. Steve has in recent years founded the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund, through which he has invested in more than 130 startups across more than 70 cities around the country. He's also led White House efforts on entrepreneurship, and he is the author of a New York Times best-selling book, The Third Wave, An Entrepreneur's Vision of the Future, and he's been enormously helpful with the Heartland Summit. Steve, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be with you and everybody.
So Steve, the Rise of the Rest strategy really grows out of this idea that there's this enormous discrepancy geographically in investing, right? More than 80% of all venture capital funding ends up in 3 states, in New York and California and in Massachusetts, or really Boston. Your goal is to change that. The Rise of the Rest works to catalyze economic development across the country and has really become a model for effective collaboration. What do you see as the key ingredients to building what you call an innovation ecosystem?
Well, as you said, the way venture capital is distributed in this country is crazy. It goes to a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of places. And the reason that's important, to be honest, I didn't know this till about 10 years ago when I was asked by President Obama to chair an initiative called Startup America. But most of the job creation comes from new companies. Startups, not from small businesses, not from big businesses, but from new businesses. So if we're not backing new businesses everywhere, we're not creating jobs everywhere, and that obviously is going to have a negative impact over time on our community. So it really is critical for philanthropists not just to think about the grants they're making, but what things they can do to really create the right environment to support a thriving startup community, be a magnet for talent, be a magnet for capital, create a culture around risk-taking and innovation. The ones that do that well, I think we'll see growth over the next 25 years. The ones that don't, we'll actually see a decline. I saw that in a rather stark fashion when I was co-founder of America Online. As you mentioned, 35 years ago, we were in the Northern Virginia area, started with a couple dozen people, then it was hundreds of people, then it was thousands of people, but tens of thousands of other jobs were created outside of AOL in the community because of that growth in home building and schools and other things. Conversely, in Detroit 100 years ago, it was booming. It's kind of like the Silicon Valley of its time. But then kind of lost a little bit of its way, lost 60% of its population and went bankrupt. And no amount of philanthropy or, for that matter, government support could fill that vacuum. Now, Detroit is fighting its way back. That's been one of the key markets we've been investing in. But I'm seeing that happen both in terms of the growth side in Northern Virginia because of AOL and the decline side in terms of Detroit was really a wake-up call to me that we need to do a better job of leveling the playing field in terms of capital and not just have it go to, as you mentioned, 3 states, but have it go everywhere in the country.
One of the things that's so exciting, of course, is that this is a for-profit strategy, and so it gives you great confidence that it can really generate sustainable economic development. What role then do you think that philanthropy can really play in bringing people together?
Huge. And it goes to the theme of this, really this discussion around collaboration. As we visited cities, and there's several parts of it. We do have, as you say, the fund that's investing in lots of different companies in lots of different cities. We also have a lot of programming and convening that we do, trying to bring people together to shine a spotlight on this issue. We published, for example, 3 playbooks, Rise the Rest playbooks, that are freely available if you go to the revolution.com site, including one just a couple of weeks ago released that talked about innovation, collaboration happening in a bunch of cities, including in the Northwest Arkansas area. The collaborative piece is critically important. What we found, and we've now done these bus tours to 43 different cities, is there's interesting things happening, but it's kind of fragmented, it's kind of siloed. And so figuring out ways to work together and partner together is critically important. Even part of the reason we go by bus, some of it is kind of this Americana thing, tends to get media attention. A couple of years ago, 60 Minutes covered what we were doing, for example. But it's also, as we're moving around town, we're actually convening people on the bus. And in every city, much to my surprise, although at this point it probably shouldn't be a surprise, we're introducing people to each other that have never met in the same community. And so it's just a reminder that this convening is critically important. I'm reminded of the African proverb: if you want to go quickly, you can go alone, but if you want to go far, you must go together. That's going to be a key ingredient, and that's what philanthropists can play a key catalyzing role in driving that convening, getting people working together across sectors. There's a role for business, including what we're trying to do with the fund. There's obviously a role for government, sort of setting the table, the rules of the road that drive a lot of the innovation policy. But there's a critical role for the philanthropic sector to really bridge these worlds and make sure they're investing in the community, not just solving problems around hunger or housing or other kinds of things, but figuring out ways to unleash opportunities so the communities they care about rise.
Yeah, well, of course, I totally agree. I think there's a huge opportunity for us there, and I love how literally you have a bus to get this all rolling. So this has been a totally crazy, challenging, difficult year. We have so many crises kind of hitting all at once and exasperating, various inequities in our country, from education to the economy, health. For example, we've known about the digital divide for years, right? But now that we have millions of children out of school, we've learned that there's actually, I believe, 12 million estimated children who don't have sufficient access to high-speed internet to be able to keep up with school. So how has it all impacted your work? What challenges have you faced this past year, and has the pandemic in any way accelerated your work?
To this initially, I remember we had conversations with you about, we were planning our next bus tour, including tying in with the Heartland Summit and also visiting Tulsa and Wichita and Oklahoma City, some other cities. And we just realized that wasn't possible last year. So we had to put that on hold and figure out ways to redirect some of our efforts to do more virtual programming like this. So there's certainly some negatives, but there are also some positives, some silver linings. I don't want to make light of what is obviously a terrible crisis in terms of 400,000 people have lost their lives, millions of people have lost their jobs, a devastating impact in our communities, in our country, really in our world. And so it's obviously been terrible. But there are a few silver linings that we can point to. And as it relates to this topic of Rise the Rest, leveling the playing field, one of them is we've seen the beginning of a talent dispersion. That for the last half century, there's kind of been a brain drain from many parts of the country, where people growing up in certain places or going to universities in certain places then left those places to go to the coast, mostly to Silicon Valley, because that's kind of where the action was in the tech sector and the innovation economy. We're seeing a little bit of a shift now in terms of talent, people making different decisions in terms of where they want to raise a family, or also what opportunities they see in this kind of next third wave of the internet. I think that bodes well, because if the talent disperses, I think over time the capital can disperse. And we've also seen, because the pandemic hit some parts of our communities particularly hard, there's a little bit of a wake-up call for people. And we saw that in our world, where venture capital, it's not just a problem in terms of the places it goes, it's also a problem in terms of the people it goes to. And 2 statistics there that I find sort of sobering and troubling. Even though women represent half our population, they get less than 10% of venture capital. Even though Black Americans are 13% of our population, Black founders get less than 1% of venture capital. So it's really, that was a wake-up call for us as well. And because we couldn't actually hit the road with our bus, we did a equity edition tour. We did a national pitch competition just for Black founders. 300 different companies applied to pitch, and the finalists really were terrific. We ended up funding, I think it was 7 of them, and we also invited 150 venture capitalists from all over the country, including Silicon Valley, to join us and to mentor those entrepreneurs. So it was a reminder to us as well that even though you can't do some of the things you were able to do before, you can look at this in new ways and try to seize some of the opportunities that this terrible crisis has created.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I saw that, and congratulations with all that work. Just back to partnerships for a second. You write in your new book that, well, it's been out for a couple years, but you write that the next wave of entrepreneurship, a good product or service will not be enough. It'll only get you so far. That partnerships will really be key for credibility and expertise. So why is that? Tell us what's different about now with partnerships and some of your experiences about what makes a partnership work.
Well, maybe take a step back, because when I was starting AOL 35 years ago, I think of it as the first wave of the internet, just getting everybody connected. We couldn't do it alone. We had over 300 partners. Everybody had to do their part to essentially stand up the internet, create the on-ramps, create the services, so there are reasons people would want to get online. So partnerships were front and center to really kind of help build the internet. In the second wave of the internet, when it was really more about apps, software, smartphones, things like that, partnerships didn't matter. Facebook actually didn't need any partners. Snapchat didn't need any partners. They launched an app, it spread virally. Suddenly it was like an overnight sensation, and they were able to do it pretty much on their own. In this third wave of the internet, when the internet meets the real world, and we're starting to change healthcare and food and agriculture, pretty fundamental aspects of our lives, pretty fundamental and important sectors of our economy, partnerships are going to be important again. In healthcare, for example, it's not the software you write, it's how you get nurses and doctors to embrace it, and hospitals to integrate it, and health plans to pay for it, and regulators to allow it. That's where the puck is going. And so recognizing that we're going to require a more multifaceted effort. And of course, the technology itself will always be core, but it's going to increasingly be the table stakes. What you do beyond that is what's going to really drive the real value creation. One example, a company we backed about 5 years ago in Chicago called Tempus. It's founded by an entrepreneur at a lot of experience in other companies. His wife actually diagnosed with breast cancer. He called a bunch of people, got a bunch of different answers, said this can't possibly be the way it works, decided to start a company that uses technology to provide much more precise diagnosis initially around cancer, but now other things. That's now scaled to 1,600 employees. And he just raised money at $8 billion. And he's saving lives because he saw a problem and decided to build an opportunity. But it wasn't that just the technology built. He's now partnering with the majority of the National Cancer Institute hospitals to bring their data into the system, so it becomes a much more accurate and precise system. So that's an example of an idea an entrepreneur saw, but the partnerships really is what accelerated its growth.
Yeah, and of course I think about Operation Warp Speed and the unprecedented collaboration around vaccine production. So it's really this year. It's a great point. We have time for one last question. We were just saying that it feels like there's a light at the end of the tunnel because we're hoping to do the Heartland Summit again in the fall. What excites you about the next 5 years, and how is the way you're thinking about big problems changing?
Well, it's like me exactly what we've been talking about. That we've been working on this idea of sort of leveling the playing field so everybody everywhere has a shot at the American dream, a shot at building a company, a shot at creating jobs. And for most of the decade, it's been sort of lonely because a lot of people have not been paying attention. I think now people are paying attention. Things like the Heartland Summit have been hugely helpful. And I think over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, it's going to go from concept to reality. I think we will see a much more robust and inclusive innovation economy. We'll see far more entrepreneurs from different communities really getting the capital they need to start and scale their businesses. As a result, we'll see more cities on the rise, kind of with momentum in their areas, and we'll see a country that will hopefully, as a result, be somewhat less divided. So this is really important. It's not about any particular startup, that particular product or service. It's about a broader idea of creating an inclusive innovation economy that allows the United States to remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. We can't rest on our laurels. We kind of 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was just sort of an idea, sort of a fragile idea. It almost didn't make it. But we led the way as a country in that whole agriculture revolution, then again led the way with the industrial revolution. More recently, we've led the way in the technology revolution. As we move forward, we need to do it in a much more inclusive way to bring everybody along and not just have a few people in a few places benefit and a lot of people in a lot of places feel left behind.
Steve, thank you so much for making time to speak with us. It's always great to see you. I hope to see you again in person, and just your work with Rise of the Rest has been such a big inspiration for what we're trying to do with kickstarting innovation in the middle of the country and change the narrative around what's happening between the coasts. Thank you so much.
There's this saying that if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And right now in this moment, we need to go fast and far to economic recovery and to economic development based on access for everyone in every part of the country. And to get there, we need to do it together with players from all sectors, leveraging each other's strengths. And 3 individuals who are joining me today have experience in doing just that. Janem Arkan, leader of Endeavor NWA, the local office of a global leader in fostering entrepreneurship. Ross Duvall, head of Heartland Forward, a think and do tank focused on economic development in the Heartland. And Maurice Jones, leader of LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which is the nation's largest community development corporation. So Maurice, I'll start with you with our first question. And your career spans multiple sectors, from a newspaper publisher to Virginia's Commerce Secretary to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And today you lead a nonprofit that leverages funding from the private sector, philanthropy, government to provide financing assistance. And you will soon lead an effort to create 1 million jobs for Black Americans. In your current role and your future role, how do you think about the public and private sector collaboration as we work toward economic recovery?
Well, first, it's nice to be with you, and I'm excited about this moment. Look, I think the way I think about recovery and reconstruction and doing it in an inclusive way, it has to include both the public sector and the private sector. There's no way to actually do it unless there are partnerships amongst those sectors. We need all of the public sector tools, for example, that will help more folks with home ownership, tools that will ensure that barriers, for example, with respect to our public institutions are eliminated. But we also need the private sector investing, in particular the private sector owning or taking ownership in the issues to be solved where they are, where they're working, where they're employing people, where they're hiring people, where they're buying goods and services. We really need the two together collaborating in order to create the kinds of vehicles needed for recovery. And most of the work I do now at LISC, a lot of what we do is bring together, we aggregate resources and funds so we can fund small businesses or fund home rental housing assistance, et cetera. It usually requires public sector resources and private sector resources working together, taking risks together, and being bold and ambitious together. So the way I think about this is the only way to ensure a bold and inclusive and a sustainable recovery is through the public and the private sector working together.
Thanks, Maurice. And Ross, I think the response that Maurice gave about private sector investing where they are is right up your alley. You've examined communities across the Heartland and identified the characteristics that build these economies. What are they?
No, thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to be with you today. The factors that really determine economic development are changing. They're moving away from kind of cost of doing business, tax rates, regulations, those still matter. But in the scheme of things today, we're finding that research universities and other four-year degree programs are really essential drivers of local economic growth. And they do that through principally two means. One is creating the human capital, the skills that are necessary to succeed, and retaining those individuals. So if you're creating the human capital at your universities, but they're going to the coasts, that doesn't benefit economic development. And so it's more than just creating it, it's retaining it locally. And we've done lots of studies showing the importance of developing the human capital and the workforce skills. But increasingly today, it is the research that's conducted at these universities that can be commercialized or transferred to the private sector through entrepreneurship, either within the institution or externally. So that is such an important ingredient. Now, not everywhere has a research university, but it's really critical, and especially within the STEM fields. If you look at which communities are doing best, it's those that are investing in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that can lead to these technology clusters that develop, where you get what an economist would call increasing returns to scale, meaning the more you add, the greater rate of return you receive. It's really difficult to overemphasize the importance of those universities and their embeddedness into the business ecosystems. Other important factors, and Heartland Forward research has demonstrated this, the importance of starting and scaling up firms. So I would call a young firm as a firm that's 5 years of age or less. And that's a measure of the startup and initial scale-up phase. And we found that those communities that have a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem create more job opportunities, create faster growth in income. And then another important factor, and this is where universities and community colleges play a role, is the knowledge intensiveness. And I would measure that by the proportion of employees at private sector firms that have a bachelor's degree or above that are 5 years of age or less. You get a much higher rate of return on that. So community colleges are very important as well, especially among smaller communities, where you have community colleges adapting the curriculum to meet the needs of local employers, to making sure that those graduates have the skill sets that those employers need. And they work very closely with them. So that's another essential ingredient. The private sector, getting access to early stage risk capital and the importance of that entrepreneurship, finding investors that are willing to stake a claim. And it's more about just the money. It's the smart money. It's the management talent. It's the oversight, the experience that these financiers have. Crowdsource funding, angel investing, where you have local investors, very important. The quality of place, quality of life, some might look at it, the arts, the culture. Today, it's increasingly about attracting and retaining talent. And if you're going to retain talent, you need to have that high quality place, whether it's recreation activities, bike trails, museums, arts, culture, whatever that mix is. And then I would say it's about collaboration and working jointly across the private sector, economic development officials, business groups, chambers of commerce, government needs to play a very important role in this process, and other nonprofits. So it's the ability to work together to create a viable message for why your place is unique. That's really essential on what determines which communities are successful.
I wonder if I could follow up with a question there, Ross, because your research really focuses on the country's most dynamic metropolitan and micropolitan areas. And you just identified the traits and characteristics you're seeing in these bright spots. I think you've also found that there are not enough of these places in the heartland. Could you speak a little to why this might be and what you think needs to change?
Yeah, great question, Karen. And I mean, the Heartland has some leaders amongst the most dynamic metropolitans. So think of Austin, Texas, the Nashville, Tennessees, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan. You go down the list, a lot of research universities that are heavily embedded in their environments. But probably one of the most important factors is many Heartland locations just don't participate in what I would call the knowledge-based economy, technology-based economic development. There are examples that out there that I just gave you, but it's partly about the universities not being as engaged in economic development and commercialization. There's some in the Heartland that do a good job, but many that don't. And they need to become more intentional about that. And economic development resources, in my opinion, are overly geared to incentive programs, recruiting, trying to target the next expansion or relocation of a firm. That should be part of a balanced portfolio of economic development, but not enough attention is devoted to building entrepreneurial awareness, capacity, the skill sets, the networks, the ecosystems for entrepreneurs to be successful. And if you look at rates of entrepreneurship, or young firms, as I've called them, they're much lower in the Heartland overall. Once again, exceptions to that. And the knowledge intensiveness of that has really diminished. So it's Heartland universities actually rank higher in terms of their research competency, but they haven't been as engaged in commercialization. So UT Austin has, University of Michigan, Madison, Wisconsin, I go down the list, Purdue has done a very good job, but that's not as spread as widely. It's not part of the kind of innovation culture as much in the Heartland. And it requires changing some paradigms. Economic development officials get rewarded for smokestack chasing, what I call, which is you bring in that next large manufacturing plant. Not that you shouldn't devote some resources towards that, but that is not the source of job creation. It's newly started firms to begin to scale up, and I think we need to focus more of our attention on supporting the building of these entrepreneurial ecosystems, because that's where all net job creation occurs in the U.S. economy. And if you're not engaged in that in the Heartland, you're simply risk being left behind.
Yep. Those are really helpful insights, Ross. And we've heard from Maurice on a national scale, and Ross, you've just spoken about a regional scale. And Janam, you're doing work on the ground in Northwest Arkansas, supporting entrepreneurs who've moved beyond startup to scale up stage. Something that Ross has just talked about as being important to building the region's economic vibrancy. So I'm curious about what collaboration tools you rely on to support entrepreneurs ready to grow their businesses.
Thanks, Karen. And it's always wonderful to talk to you about this subject. And Ross, I feel like you've sort of gave me the perfect segue. But in thinking about this conversation, I started thinking about human capital and the fantastic effect of compounding. And not necessarily in the traditional financial sense, which is also important, but really in the sense of, how does human capital, the power of human networks, compound? And that's really one of the underlying currents of endeavor in what we do. But my idea and the theory that we've studied is that creating these networks, creating mentorships and access to people who've been there, done that, being able to scale these growing businesses has such a huge impact. And that's really what we focus on in Northwest Arkansas. I want to be able to give the companies here, work with the scaling companies, the tech-enabled companies, the companies that have super productivity, and help them get to that next level. Because a 50-person company becoming a 400-person company is incredibly impactful for the small businesses in Northwest Arkansas as inspiration, as future founder to funders, as people whose employees spin off and start their own companies. So it's really this network effect in our local ecosystem and connecting the people who've done that, and in Louisville or in Detroit or in Egypt or in Latin America. And it's something that we really focus on, is creating a safe space for people to talk about their problems, to talk about the challenges they're facing, to scaling a business in a traditionally underserved market. So scaling a business in Northwest Arkansas is very different than scaling a business in Boston. And we want to give people the tools to work with those challenges. The one thing I was thinking about this past year, maybe a note of hope, is that people typically overestimate what they think they're going to get done in a year, but underestimate what they're going to get done in a decade. So when you think about the work we're going to do and the compounding effect of all that, the work in Northwest Arkansas has started and it is moving. But in 10 years, we'll look back and say, wow, the networks that we established in the past 10 years have had a tremendous economic impact on jobs, on wages, on inspiration, on capital. And so the work feels slow right now, but it's going to have a huge impact. And I think about, the data that we know. Warren Buffett's 99% of his wealth he accumulated after the age of 50. And so when you think about that, even though he's been investing for the prior 40 years behind that, that's that effect of compounding growth. And that's what we want to do for companies in Northwest Arkansas.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you're using mentorship and Endeavor's global network to foster entrepreneurs' success in Northwest Arkansas.
Sure. So one of the really exciting things, I think, is that Northwest Arkansas is actually an incredibly well-connected community. People here know each other, they talk to each other, they rely on each other. And what I love about the work we do, and it's very one-on-one, so the number of companies we support are hopefully the high-growing companies that are going to have the biggest impact. Because when you look at the companies that have the highest impact, they're the companies that can grow to 50 in the first 3 years, employees, for example. We really want to take those companies and connect them to people who are in adjacent industries where there are partnerships available or acquisitions possible. And we want to connect them to people who have grown and exited their businesses to give them advice. So, that ranges from everything on, we have an entrepreneur who's been selected as an Endeavor entrepreneur locally, who's done a leadership program at Harvard, Stanford, and INSEAD through the Endeavor Network. So they were able to sit down with 12 of their peers and do a 3-week course at those universities to talk about the challenges that they're facing, how to be better leaders, how to inspire, how to sell better, how to grow better, how to have a bigger game plan. But at the same time, we can do things like we put together a board member in Endeavor Turkey with a company in Northwest Arkansas because they wanted to talk about expansion into the Middle East. And then she put them in touch with 5 other people. So this is again, going back to this compounding network of how do we connect somebody to help you think about your business. And by the way, it's not just that person, it's the 5 other people they're connected to and the 5 other people they're connected to. So we do that it's a very hand-holding, it's a very intense process, but I think it's one that has a huge impact in terms of this compounding effect that I mentioned.
Thanks, Janam. It's been just as an observer of some of the collaboration that happens in the Heartland has been really interesting to me in a time when we are talking often about the division we see across the country. And so I'm curious, Maurice, we talk about how collaboration across sectors is a challenge, but collaboration across traditional lines of division can seem even more challenging and sometimes hopeless. And so I'm wondering how we can approach economic development in a way that helps people come together for a common purpose, even when they might not see eye to eye on other matters.
Yeah, I see this actually going on all across the country. You see healthcare and banking and the public sector coming together to increase the supply of affordable housing, for example, in a place. And they're doing it because they know that in order to keep their city or their region competitive and great, they need housing that their workers can afford and that are of high quality, right? And so one way to think about what can bring people together is their passion and need for the people that make up their family, friends, labor force, et cetera, for them to have opportunities to thrive, and for the place where they are working, living, and operating a business to continue to be competitive. So we see sectors, I just mentioned that the healthcare piece and the banking piece. You go. I'm thinking of a program that we're working on in a state, in a southern state, where what people are doing, you've got the business community and the nonprofit community coming together, investing in reskilling individuals who are coming out of incarceration. And the businesses are there because they need the talent. And the nonprofits are there because they are able to actually provide the kinds of workforce development and wraparound services pieces in order to get people in a place where they're prepared to thrive in these jobs. So from my standpoint, economic development, economic recovery, it's a team sport. And I think what brings people together across sectors in this space is the need, number one, to attract, develop, and retain great talent. That crosses all sectors. And number two, to keep the place where they're living, working, raising a family, et cetera, keep it on the trajectory that would keep it competitive and keep it attractive to new talent. Those two pieces in particular are bringing people together all around the country, across sector, across races, across generations, to work together for improvement and advancement. And it's never been more important than it is right now.
Absolutely. 2020 upended lives and economies, and I'd love to hear one innovative idea from each of you that you believe will benefit communities and economies going forward. And Janeb, I wondered if you might have something you'd like to share on that point.
There's a lot we need to do, so it feels overwhelming to pick one answer. But I think, particularly as the way we address the world and something that we do, we have a venture capital fund ourselves through Endeavor Catalyst, and Fund 3 is about $140 million. But I think the work that started in 2020 about raising capital for women, founders of color, for people who were traditionally underserved, to really create a system where people can access capital who have not historically had access to capital. That is going to be, I don't know if you would consider that an innovation, but that is a mechanism, and that is a requirement, I think, to be able to really advance communities in Northwest Arkansas, but really around the U.S. And I'm very excited to see the fruits of the labor that started in 2020. Probably should have started many years before that, but that's something I think needs to happen and should happen for us to see that change.
Maurice, I wonder if you might build on that. I know as you look forward, this is definitely an area of interest of yours as well.
So let me give you one idea, and it's actually an idea that I'm moving to. If you look at this country, 60% of the adult working population in this country are individuals without 4-year degrees. If you actually broke that down and you looked at, say, the African American population, it's 80%. One of the things that we have got to look at as a country, and in particular as a business community, is whether our requirements for folks to get into jobs that pay livable wages, that include 4-year degrees, are actually right. Whether you really need that 4-year degree to do that work, or do you need skills certain skills that you either bring to the table or that we can equip you with to do that work. And so skills-based hiring and advancing is an idea that I believe could revolutionize our economy, bring more talent, make our business community even more productive and robust. And it's something that I'm hoping to work on for quite some time moving forward.
Thanks, Maurice. So access to capital, skills-based hiring. Ross, what are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are around remote work and the opportunities it provides for the Heartland. Certainly, communities on the coast will benefit as we go to more permanent remote work. COVID has demonstrated that we can collaborate over longer distances, and we don't have to all be in the same office to do so. But for the Heartland, I think looking at millennials and other young people who were paying extremely high housing costs on the coast to live in San Francisco or San Diego or Boston, up and down the East Coast, same thing. If they were from the Heartland, they're now looking to the Heartland as an area they could live in and work. Whether they continue to work for that same company, it could be Google, Salesforce, you go down the list. But I think it brings home the values of the Heartland, and it, I believe, will help us retain more of the talent that we create here and attract back to the Heartland, because this could be a game changer, bringing in this talent that's tech savvy, that has experience in entrepreneurship, understanding how to make a pitch to a venture capitalist or an angel investor. And so I see that as a major opportunity for the Heartland to capitalize on remote work.
Thanks, Ross. And thanks to each of you for sharing with us how you foster collaboration, and to steal a phrase from Maurice, through common need and purpose. You've offered just critical insights as we all set ambitious goals for our joint efforts over the next 5 years. And I'll now turn things over to the Walton Family Foundation's K-12 Education Program Director, Mark Sternberg. Thanks.